The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Hello everyone, welcome back to the Trumpet Daily. Last month, Pope Francis announced that the Catholic Church would not accept a Middle East without Christians. After meeting with Christian leaders from the region, the Pope said, "We will not resign ourselves to imagining a Middle East without Christians." He went on to say that he will not rest while there are still men and women of any religion whose dignity is affronted, who are stripped of the basics necessary for survival, whose future is stolen, who are forced to become refugees or displaced people. Now, the Pope said he is particularly concerned about the mass exodus of Christians in Syria, Iraq, and Egypt, but really it's happening all across the Islamic world, this massive exodus of Christians. A century ago, the Christian population in the Middle East amounted to about 20% of the total population, and today it's dwindled to about 3 or 4%. According to the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, the flight of Christians out of the region is unprecedented, and it's increasing year by year. Now, to just look at a few examples, in Iraq, for example, before Saddam Hussein's regime was toppled, there were 1.4 million Christians in the nation, and today there's fewer than 200,000. Over the past 10 years, dozens of Christian churches have been destroyed, hundreds of Christians have been beheaded, and so people are leaving the nation. In Syria, you've seen a lot about that civil war in the news in recent months, and after the outbreak of that war, and beginning in 2011, radical Islamic groups seized their opportunity to wipe out entire Christian communities. The city of Homs, as one example, has been pretty much cleansed of Christians. It used to have about 80,000 Christians, and the ongoing violence has caused an estimated 300,000 Christian Syrians to flee the nation so far. Egypt also, you've heard about the Copt Christians in that nation. We've had quite a lot to say about that at thetrumpet.com. But look at what's happened to the Christians in Egypt since the beginning of the Arab Spring. Jihadists have crucified Christians on trees, burned churches, and have targeted Christian women and girls for kidnapping, rape, and forced conversion to Islam. Since the fall of Hosni Mubarak in 2011, Islamist attacks have driven more than 100,000 Christian Copts out of the country. So, and of course, there was that story a while back too, about the destruction of the last Jewish synagogue in Egypt as well. So there's practically no Jews in the nation of Egypt today. Now, Egypt used to be one of the more moderate nations in the Middle East, even though it was ruled by a dictator. As you know, we've written so many times before at our website that Mubarak was a strong ally for the United States, and the forces of radicalism have certainly taken over in that nation. Well, those are 3 examples, but it's the same story, really. If you look at Libya, there's just a few thousand Christians left. In Lebanon, they used to have, I think, just a little bit of a Christian majority in that nation, 51, 52% just a few decades ago. And today it's dwindled, the Christian population has dwindled down to about 1/3. It's the same story in Iran, it's the same story in Pakistan. Let me just give you a quote from Foreign Affairs. This is from September the 11th, 2013. This author says, "What we're witnessing is nothing less than a regional religious cleansing that will soon prove to be a historic disaster for Christians and Muslims alike." Now, I don't know if that journalist really understands just how historic the disaster will be, but that author is right about what's coming. Now, from the Vatican's perspective, even though, as I mentioned at the top, the Pope has drawn attention to Syria and Iraq and Egypt in particular. But really the most alarming aspect of this religious cleansing is what's happening in the Holy Land, what's happening in and around Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem is the birthplace of Christianity, and of course it's very important to other world religions too, the Jews and of course Islam. But for Catholics, I mean, that's the center of their religious universe. In 1946, just to give you a few more facts and figures about this mass exodus, in 1946, the city, Jerusalem that is, was composed of about 20% Muslims and 20% Christians, and then a variety of others to go with it. But by 2009, the number of Muslims in Jerusalem amounted to 33%, whereas the Christian population had dwindled to about 2%. I mean, these are some alarming trends, and it's going in a direction that is causing great concern inside the Vatican. You can see why. The Vatican is stirring. Last year, Francis's predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, he used a trip to the Middle East to urge Christian minorities to stay there, to not emigrate, but to stay there and to not give in to the sense of victimization, as he called it. And now, of course, following in Benedict's steps, Francis is saying that he won't rest until this situation is resolved. So what does it mean? What do these statements mean? And where is this leading? You can't imagine, really, hundreds of millions of Catholics just sitting back, even as they see their brothers and sisters persecuted and killed, crucified in some cases, throughout these nations in the Middle East. That's what's been happening. Well, really, what this is building toward is another religious crusade. That's what the Bible tells us. Another religious war is coming. Even history teaches us that lesson. Now, most people I know assume that we've just simply become too modern, too sophisticated to ever have a war like something from the 11th century. But it is coming. It's amazing, the blindness of human nature, even with the Iranian nuclear bomb problem that we're going to be staring at here for the next several months. As controversial as that is on how to handle it, most people, even the ones that say we should stop the program from moving forward, they really don't think that those bombs will ever explode, but they will. They will at some point. And in the case of our subject here today, there is going to be one last religious crusade. As I say, if you just look at a little bit of history, you can understand that the Crusades were basically a series of Roman Catholic holy wars that were intended to wrest control of the Holy Land away from Islam. And it was, of course, centered around Jerusalem, but it affected large swaths of area all through the Middle Eastern region. I mentioned the 11th century. That's when really the first, or at least the big crusade that kicked off a series of them, started under Pope Urban II, where he unleashed this savage army, this Catholic army basically, to go on a rampage 3,000 miles away to the Holy Land. I just want to give you a few quotes from a book called The Crusades, written by Terry Jones and Alan Arira, and this became a BBC series as well. But these authors write, by summoning, this is about the Pope Urban II period, they write, by summoning an army under the banner of the cross, the Pope was extending the Church's mantle over all Christendom. This was the idea at the very heart of the revolutionary papacy. In place of separate local churches at the center of discrete communities, there was to be one overarching church ruled by one overarching pope. The crusade was to be its expression and its instrument. See, it was a violent and bloody crusade, but the end justified the means. I mean, you've got to get the Holy Land. That's the religious center, Jerusalem. This book says Urban's army would also rescue Jerusalem, the spiritual and therefore the physical center of the universe. He hoped that the redeemed Jerusalem would be directly ruled by the church. Every man who enrolled for the struggle must mark himself out by wearing a cross and, most important, vow to continue on his way until he reached Jerusalem. See, the focus was on Jerusalem, that city that we've talked about so often at thetrumpet.com. This book says, fighting in the Pope's cause was not only an obligation, it made you righteous. With that one idea, mass political action was launched. With that one idea, ideology was born. With that one idea, the crusade was set in motion. It says, Urban did not understand what he had done. He didn't understand what he had started, but what he started led to a number of indescribably brutal wars between Catholics and Muslims. Brutal wars. Let's look at Daniel 11, just go through a few verses here in this prophecy that we refer you to quite often. Of course, the Islamic states were not about to just sit back and allow the Catholics to have control, so it was a lot of back and forth, and as I say, a lot of brutality, a lot of bloodshed, rivers of blood in and around Jerusalem during that very dark period of history that we don't want to forget. The world so quickly forgets these important lessons of history. I mean, here we're seeing Christians being persecuted throughout these Islamic states in the Middle East. And if we're to look back at history and say, well, now how will Christian Europe respond to that eventually? Even in this modern age, with, by the way, all these modern weapons that we have, you know how it's going to turn out if you just know a little bit of history. But much more than that, I mean, we've got the Bible to serve as our guide as well, to tell us what's coming, what's ahead. Daniel 11 here, in verse 40, it says, And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him, and the king of the north shall come against him like a whirlwind, with chariots and with horsemen, and with many ships, and he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. So God says there's going to be this clash between the kings of the north and the kings of the south, or the king of the north and the king of the south. But it's a group of nations supporting each king. The king of the north is led by Germany, as we've said so many times before. Mr. Armstrong, of course, taught us that many decades ago. But there's going to be this union between Europe and the Vatican, as other prophecies bring out. And then the king of the south, of course, is Iran, and the rest of radical Islam that will be united with Iran. And those two, the Bible says, are going to clash. And it's going to come after a significant and aggressive push on the part of the king of the south. A push at Europe. A push at Christianity. A push at Germany. And we see that very aggressive push. That aggressive pushing is already happening. It'll certainly revolve around Jerusalem, but of course there's other things that factor in as well. Now, 20 years ago, you couldn't have really looked at these regions, the heart of Europe and the Vatican, and then the king of the south being in Iran, and say, well, these are two world powers that are surely going to set off an explosion when they clash. But now, 20 years on, we're beginning to see these two world powers emerge. Europe still needs its emperor to go along with this church-state union, and that's coming. You think about Iran's pursuit of the bomb, you think about Russia's power grab as it moves into the Ukraine and pushes right up against Europe. You think about the disappearance of the United States. There's just all kinds of significant factors crying out for this leader in Europe to come forward. He's coming soon. And when he does, Europe's going to start showing strength like this world hasn't seen in a few generations. And that wrath is going to be aimed at the king of the south, as this prophecy says. speaking of the king of the north, verse 41 says, he shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown. So what's this saying is there's going to be a Christian resurgence. And by Christian, I mean the mother church headed in Rome. There's going to be a Christian resurgence in the Middle East, in and around Jerusalem in particular. But it's not going to lead to peace. This is the lesson of history as well. It's not going to lead to peace. In fact, it's going to result in a great double cross. It says over in Ezekiel 23. I'll just leave that for you to study on your own. But coming back to this verse here in verse 41, enter there implies that they're going to be coming into the Holy Land, into the area around Jerusalem by invitation. Evidently the Jews, the Israelis invite them in to try to keep things from exploding. But in fact, that just leads to the big explosion of all. Jesus in the Gospels even talked about it being a relatively peaceful-looking entry into Jerusalem, but it's not going to stay peaceful. Verse 42 says, he shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape, but he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. So many other Muslim countries are going to fall to this Vatican-led European power. Twice there it mentions Egypt in those couple of verses. Egypt, and as I say, that used to be one of the most moderate nations in the whole region. And now there's the struggle back and forth between the army and the Muslim Brotherhood. And look at what's happening to the Christians in the meantime. They're being slaughtered. They're fleeing the country in droves. And the heart of Europe, the Vatican, is taking note that where its followers are being persecuted. Verse 44, it says, but tidings out of the east and out of the north shall trouble him. Therefore he shall go forth and with great fury to destroy and utterly to make away many. So tidings out of the east, the Orient, tidings out of the north, Russia. They're going to be very disturbing as Europe goes on its power grab down into the Middle East and then lurches out at those kings of the east. A strike, which of course by then we're into this great world war. That's just going to draw all these nations in, as so many prophecies bring out. But notice what it says here in verse 45. It says, and he, this is speaking of the religious head of this European combine. It's a church-state union, as Revelation tells us. And he, this religious head, shall plant the tabernacles of his palace between the seas, in the glorious holy mountain, between the two seas, the Mediterranean Sea, the Dead Sea, and the glorious holy mountain. Mount Zion, right in the heart of Jerusalem. That's where this Christian leader is going to plant his headquarters. It's only going to be there for a short time, though. Verse 45 again, it says, yet he shall come to his end, and none shall help him. So it's not going to be a permanent place of residence for this religious leader. Now the vision continues right on into Daniel 12 and verse 1. And this verse gives us some idea of just how widespread the violence, the suffering will be. And at that time shall Michael stand up, the great prince, which stands for the children of your people, and there shall be a time of trouble such as never was since there was a nation, even to that same time. And at that time your people shall be delivered, every one that shall be found written in the book. Never, ever a trouble like this, Daniel said. It's very similar to what it says in Jeremiah 30 about Jacob's trouble, and of course in the Gospels, Matthew 24, the great tribulation. Jesus said, the likes of which this world has never seen this kind of destruction and bloodshed. And yet as bad as the news is, you can continue right through with a lot of the detail that's brought out in Daniel chapter 12, which really talks about God's faithful people who are going to be protected through all this. And it also gives us somewhat of a countdown, a specific countdown, in fact, leading us right up to the return of Jesus Christ. Look at verse 12 in particular. This is Daniel 12 and verse 12. It says, blessed is he that waits and comes to the 1,305 and 30 days. Blessed are you if you wait on God, if you look to God, if you patiently look to the return of Jesus Christ. That's what counting down the days here is all about in Daniel 12. It points us to the return of Jesus Christ, this greatest event in the history of the universe. Now, much of this history that I cover from Daniel 11 and 12, and also earlier in the Crusades history from your history books, Pope Urban II and so on, a lot of that is summarized in this booklet, The King of the South. There's a chapter in here actually titled The Last Crusade that's coming. Now, I just want to take a little bit of a turn, not that far actually, because we had a feature recently on the trumpet.com website that talked about the current Pope, the present Pope, and in just looking at Pope Francis today, he's received quite a lot of praise from the media, and he's taken on this softer approach, as you've probably seen in various reports. And it might be hard to visualize Europe really going on another Catholic-inspired crusade in the years ahead. And as I say, this Pope certainly has a more soft-spoken, less confrontational sounding approach than his predecessor. If you look at some of the things that Benedict said throughout his papacy, he prayed once for God to stop the murderous hand of those who, driven by fanaticism and hatred, would commit acts of terror. That was pretty much a direct slap at Islam, and representatives of the Islamic religion didn't like it at all when he'd make comments like that. That was from 2005. But Benedict routinely called for Europe to return to its Christian roots. He routinely called for this Christian revival in Europe, and the Vatican still has some work to do for that revival to be complete. But it is coming. It is coming. And Pope Francis, while he's been very careful about what he says, if you read between the lines and just leave aside the media that has praised him with so much, really nothing has changed as far as the Church's teaching or its ideology. It's very similar to what it's always been. But this softer, gentler approach, I think, is improving the image of the Church, in some cases dramatically. So that's what this feature deals with, this 4 or 5 minute video feature that we've put together about Pope Francis and his increasing popularity around the world. So we'll conclude with that, and then see you next time on the Trumpet Daily.
Some Bible prophecy watchers have been on the lookout only for a firebrand pope. They've been watching for a real zealot who seems capable of spearheading a revival all across Europe of uncompromising conservative Catholicism. But Pope Francis I seems to be a different kind of pope. During his short time in office, Francis has reached out to all religions. He even reached out to atheists, saying, "God forgives those who do not believe and do not seek faith." Regarding homosexuals, Francis said, "Who am I to judge them? They're our brothers." On the topic of abortion and contraception, Pope Francis recently said, "It is not necessary to talk about these issues all the time." These are all areas that previous popes had usually taken a hard conservative stance on. Especially as compared to these earlier leaders, Francis seems very gentle, liberal, and inclusive. Because of this, some Bible prophecy watchers may find it easy to be dismissive of Francis. His attitude may make him seem unlikely to become the Pope who comes to wield great sway over Europe's politics, or to rally Europeans to the Catholic fold. But this view may not factor in the understanding that Europe, in terms of religion, is not the continent it was 50, 20, or even 10 years ago. Look at France, for example. Back in 1965, over 80% of French people called themselves Catholic. By 2011, the number of France's Catholics and other Christians combined was just 54%. The decrease in the number of France's active Christians is even more significant. In France today, less than 1% of the people go to church services weekly. The shift has been even sharper in Germany. In 1950, over 96% of Germans identified as Christians. Today, it's less than 60%, and only 1.2% of Germans now attend church services regularly. This trend is consistent throughout Europe. Why is this sharp decline happening? It's happening mostly because of the rise of secularism. Modern Europeans are rejecting absolutes in religion more and more. Even as recently as 2005, only about 14% of French people described themselves as convinced atheists. By 2012, that number had jumped to 29%. During that same time, the number of Germany's staunch atheists jumped from 10 to 15%, and the Czech Republic's went from 20 to 30%. A ranking of the world's top 10 nations by percentage of atheists shows that 7 are now in Europe. This is a momentous shift, and it's not just the confirmed atheists. Even of those who still say they are Christian, belief is now being watered down at a staggering rate. About half of the Catholics in France right now say they are not even sure that God exists. Europe is undergoing a deep ideological shift, and the number of people practicing active Christianity is in very sharp decline. It was in the midst of this decline that Benedict took his bow and Francis entered the Vatican. And Francis has been rebranding the Mother Church as a bastion of acceptance. The results of this rebranding have worked wonders in making the Church more popular among Europeans. Pope Francis is now the most discussed person on the internet. He has also won the respect of the media and has spawned a surge in Catholic Church attendance in many European countries. It's too early to say whether Francis is spearheading a Vatican spring. It's too early to know if he'll be the Pope who steers the Church through the time just before the return of Jesus Christ. But it is undeniable that Francis is significantly improving the way Europeans think about the Mother Church. Francis's gentleness, his embrace of secularists, and other inclusive gestures put him in a prime position to do what Catholic leaders have often done best: assimilate the views of the masses into church teaching in order to convert those masses and to lead them. Bible prophecy says that in the end time, the Roman Catholic Church's leadership will appear to be gentle, sincere, and like a lamb. In some ways, this description fits Francis better than any pope in recent memory.